Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting into one of history's grayest corners. Not every villain hides in the shadows, and not every hero stands in the light. Sometimes the same hand that signs an execution order also funds a schoolhouse. This is the story of a ruthless dictator who silenced dissent with one breath and taught children to read with the next. So, if you came expecting a clear-cut tale of good versus evil, you might be in for something slower, quieter, and a little more complicated. Get comfortable, because this one unfolds in dusty classrooms, guarded by watchful eyes, where history's contradictions whisper you to sleep. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love the story. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Tomorrow, come back and tell me which part of the story you fell asleep during. I'd really love to know. Now lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1. From Privilege to Guerrilla. The dawn light filtered through the lace curtains of the family villa in Byron, illuminating the polished cane-colored floors and the rows of mahogany furniture. Young Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz awoke to the distant hum of sugar mill machinery, the backbone of his family's wealth. His father, Angel Castro, a hard-nosed immigrant from Spain, had grown rich on these very plantations. In this gilded world, Fidel's earliest memories were of horse rides down dusty lanes, cricket matches beneath wide canopied trees, and afternoons spent in a library filled with leather-bound volumes. He was the eldest of 6 children, born into a world that promised comfort. But even as a boy, he possessed an unquiet curiosity. At age 8, Fidel gazed at the twin peaks of Turkey Peak, those rocky outcroppings near the estate, and asked his tutor why some men lived in palaces while others toiled in cane fields for a single loaf of bread. His tutor hesitated. In that moment, the seed of doubt was planted. It grew slowly, branching into questions about justice, privilege, and power. Fidel's adolescence unfolded in Santiago de Cuba, the city of fiery sunsets and vibrant street life. He attended the Jesuit-run Colegio de Belén, where strict discipline met rigorous academics. There he excelled in rhetoric and history. He thundered through debates on Roman republics and constitutional theory. Yet outside the classroom, the sharp contrast between opulent haciendas and crumbling shacks troubled him. In the shadow of the school's ornate chapel, he encountered ragged children begging for rupees. The sight of toothless grandmothers scavenging for sugarcane scraps left an imprint on his heart. At 16, he embarked for Havana, enrolling at the University of Havana. The electric pulse of the capital, with its wide boulevards and car horns, struck him as both exhilarating and unsettling. He rented a modest room above a panaderia in Vedado. His days began with the click of typewriter keys as he thumbed through law texts, and his evenings ended in smoky cafes, where students and intellectuals debated Fidel's favorite subjects: imperialism, agrarian reform, and the rights of workers. In those smoky rooms, he met people who shared his discontent. There was Antonio, a lanky student with idealistic eyes; Marta, a fiery young woman who spoke of peasant uprisings; and Jose, an ex-communist who introduced Fidel to Marx and Engels. Night after night, they dissected the legacies of Lenin and Trotsky, pondering how a small country like Cuba could chart a new course independent of the United States. Politically, Havana in the early 1950s was a tinderbox. Fulgencio Batista, former sergeant turned coup leader, ruled with an iron hand. Outside the presidential palace, peasants petitioned for land, workers struck for fair wages, and university students, among them Fidel, picketed and chanted slogans for democracy. Police batons cracked skulls, and the hum of machine guns echoed down dim alleyways. Fidel witnessed these scenes but never feared. He felt a fierce conviction that the status quo was intolerable. It was during one demonstration in March of 1952 that Batista crushed the opposition. Tanks rumbled into the streets before the ballots were even cast. Judges were replaced with loyalists, and the Constitution lay in tatters. University campuses were shuttered. Among the crowd of beaten protesters, several students lay motionless in the stone courtyards. Fidel bent over one of them, gently feeling for a pulse. When none was found, his knuckles whitened. The image of that young man, eyes staring at the sky, became a silent vow for Castro. He would not rest until justice was restored. Barred from legal politics, Fidel turned to more radical means. He convened with a small cadre of friends in an abandoned warehouse on Calle San Lazaro. Under the glow of a single naked bulb, they plotted their first action: the seizure of the Moncada army barracks in Santiago de Cuba. It was July 26, 1953, an audacious gamble. They filled backpacks with homemade grenades and a handful of revolvers. In those claustrophobic streets, a mixture of adrenaline and fear coursed through Fidel's veins. At dawn, they stormed forward, their voices echoing off the barracks walls as they shouted, "Viva la Revolution!" But the plan unraveled with brutal swiftness. Batista's troops poured from guardhouses and cut them down with machine gun fire. Dozens of rebels were killed or captured. Fidel, bleeding from a shoulder wound, managed to retreat into nearby sugarcane fields. For 2 days, he lurked among the stalks, the staccato crack of rifles growing fainter with each passing hour. When he finally surfaced, the price of failure was clear. Dozens of his companions lay dead, and he himself faced certain imprisonment. Batista's courts moved quickly. By August he stood trial, flanked by a press eager to publicly humiliate him. They accused him of sedition and murder, but Fidel transformed the courtroom into a platform. He spoke for hours in a voice that never trembled. He defended his actions not as a criminal but as a patriot bound by duty to his people. His closing words, later published as the essay "History Will Absolve Me," echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. "I am at odds with the world, an individual in revolt. Yet I do not revolt for the sake of revolt. I revolt to change reality." Those words electrified a generation. Even behind the walls of Presidio Modelo on the Isle of Pines, where he was sentenced to 16 years, news of his speech spread like wildfire. Fellow prisoners recited his lines in whispers. Guards found them scrawled on toilet walls. In that bleak cell block, the seeds of his legend took root. In 1955, Batista, under pressure from U.S. authorities seeking stability, granted amnesty to political prisoners. Fidel walked free, gaunt but unbowed. He crossed the prison gates and stepped into a world both familiar and transformed. He spent months in exile in Mexico City, working odd jobs to make ends meet, all the while networking with other Latin American radicals. It was there that he met Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor-turned-revolutionary.
Cs calm intensity balanced fidelesse fieri eloquence.
Together, they recruited a small force determined to sail back to Cuba and wage guerrilla war. As winter turned to spring, the makeshift grandma yacht stood ready on the Gulf of Mexico. 78 men crowded its decks, farmers, students, idealists. They carried rifles, seeds of hope, and carefully folded copies of History Will Absolve Me. When they set sail on November 25, 1956, they did so under a single banner: to liberate Cuba from tyranny. The voyage was harrowing. Storms battered the rusting hull, and seasickness claimed half the crew. When they sighted Cuba's shores 5 days later, only 27 remained coherent. They beached at Pleiades, in Orient Province, emerging into a world of dense jungle and hostile militia patrols. From then on, they became guerrillas, moving in hammock silence through swamps, speaking only in whispers, fighting to survive. It would be 2 years before they marched into Havana. But in those first desperate months, the transformation in Fidel was complete. His polished aristocratic accent had hardened into a commanding baritone. His smooth hands, once accustomed to quill pens and fine leather, now bore calluses from packing ammunition. Yet beneath the hardened exterior, the same boyish curiosity lay latent, ready to question each choice, each tactic, each alliance. By the time the revolution captured its first villages, news of their exploits had spread across the countryside. Word of mouth painted Fidel as both ruthless commander and benevolent liberator. He ordered the execution of captured Batista officers, declaring it a necessary measure to prevent reprisals. He also opened makeshift schools in liberated hamlets, inviting illiterate peasants to learn to read the speeches he had written in prison. In that duality, harsh discipline alongside tender outreach, we glimpsed the man on the cusp of power, a visionary intellect tempered by iron will, a champion of equality cloaked in the mantle of authoritarian command. The road from Byron to the Sierra Maestra had reshaped him. The boy who once pondered justice from the balcony of his family home was now the guerrilla who carried it in his rifle stock and recited it over crackling radio broadcasts. And so, as the first chapter of his life closed, Castro stood at the threshold of history. Behind him lay the comforts of privilege and the blood-stained sands of Moncada. Ahead lay the promise of a nation remade, and the heavy burden of leadership in a world that would refuse to surrender quietly. Chapter 2: The Moncada Defeat and the Road to Sierra Maestra. The humid air of Santiago de Cuba pressed against Fidel Castro's skin like a silent accusation. It was July 26, 1953, and the city still slumbered beneath an early morning haze. Most men lay dreaming of sugarcane fortunes or Havana's bright lights. Fidel lay awake, heart pounding, in a cramped safe house on Calle San Lazaro. Around him, 50 young men, law students, factory workers, peasants, loaded grenades into rucksacks and checked pistols for loose cartridges. They moved with deliberate calm, each man silent in his own thoughts. At 4:30 a.m., Fidel slipped outside. The horizon barely glowed, the streets were empty, and the pavement glistened with dew. In the distance stood the Moncada Army Barracks, an imposing fortress of concrete and steel where Batista's soldiers trained in the brutal arts of oppression. Tonight, Castro's ragtag band meant to breach those walls, ignite a nationwide revolt, and overthrow Cuba's dictator. He found his lieutenant, William Alexander Morgan, a lanky Afro-Cuban from Havana's docks, and peered at the barracks through field glasses. "Are you sure we can take it?" Fidel whispered. Morgan nodded. "Surprise is our ally. We strike before dawn. We take the armory. We rally citizens to rise with us." The two clasped forearms in a soldier's salute. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, Fidel Castro stood atop a ridge overlooking the city of Bayamo, the cradle of independence. Smoke rose from distant hamlets. At his feet, hundreds of guerrillas readied for the march to Moron, then east to Santa Clara, and finally to Havana itself. His once pristine guayabera was now olive green, stained with sweat and earth. His hands bore calluses from shoveling foxholes. His voice, once confined to courtrooms, now thundered across radio waves. Behind him lay the bloodied sands of Moncada, the echo of prison walls, and the isolation of exile. Ahead lay a battered nation yearning for change. In those misty mountains, amid the chorus of tropical birds and the whisper of palm fronds, a revolution born of defeat and bound by hope strode forward. The road to Sierra Maestra would give way to the road to Havana, and to the moment when a ragged band of idealists would ignite the flame that toppled a dictator. By 5 a.m. they were in position. Castro whistled sharply. The rebels surged forward, shouting, "Viva la Revolution!" Their grenades clattered against barracks gates. Pistol shots rang out. At first, it seemed the surprise had worked. Guards stumbled back, rifles fumbling. But then floodlights snapped on, and Batista's troops poured from guardhouses in perfect ranks. Machine gun fire tore through the attackers. Grenades exploded against the gate. Within minutes, half the rebels lay dead or wounded. Castro himself took a blast of buckshot to the shoulder but pressed on, rallying the survivors to charge the secondary gate on Carlos Manuel de Cespedes Street. They fought with desperation. Pistol butt blows, bayonet thrusts, hand-to-hand scuffles. But the soldiers were too well armed, too disciplined. Outnumbered nearly 10-1, the rebels faltered and retreated into nearby alleys. Fidel stumbled into the darkness, blood seeping through his white guayabera. Around him lay the bodies of comrades, young men who had followed his words into the jaws of death. For 2 days, he hid in cane fields and peasant huts, living on water from roadside streams. At night, he listened to government patrols pounding the earth with boots, the snarled voices of soldiers accusing locals of harboring him. By July 28th, the search quietly eased. Castro, gaunt but unbroken, surrendered to a rural militia captain. He told the captain, "I would rather die free than live in chains." They arrested him, bound his hands, and loaded him onto a truck. Word of the assault on Moncada spread swiftly through Cuba. Government newspapers labeled Fidel and his comrades terrorists, murderers, criminals. Yet among students, peasants, and intellectuals, these labels rang hollow. In smoky cafes and clandestine meetings, people whispered of a new kind of hero, one who dared to challenge Batista's iron fist. On August 22, 1953, Fidel Castro stood before Judge Oscar Fernandez in the provincial courthouse. With him were 75 co-defendants, men condemned to die, and he spoke not as a beaten prisoner but as a lawyer in his element. He wore a crisp white shirt, white trousers, and polished shoes, clothing more suited to a summer gala than a death sentence. He bowed politely and addressed the judges. I appear before you not to beg mercy, but to defend our cause, liberty for all Cubans. Over the next 3 days, Castro delivered the speech that would become his manifesto. History will absolve me. He spoke of agrarian reform, the nationalization of industries, universal education, health care for the poor, and the dignity of labor. In eloquent cadences, he argued that real justice meant dismantling the power structures that kept Cuba in chains. In the gallery sat students and sympathetic citizens, hanging on every word. Outside, press photographers snapped shots of Castro's impassioned gestures. On the prison courtyard walls of Presidio Modelo, where he was to be confined, guards would later find his speech scrawled in chalk, word for word, by fellow inmates. Despite the power of his words, the court found him guilty of sedition and murder, sentencing him to 16 years. Yet the trial had given Castro what Moncada could not: a platform. His words, published in newspapers and printed in pamphlets, galvanized support. Under cover of night, activists distributed mimeographed copies of History Will Absolve Me, and Fidel's once quiet name became a rallying cry. In October 1953, Castro was transferred to Presidio Modelo, a panopticon prison on the Isle of Pines. Its circular cell blocks, built to monitor inmates at all times, now held both criminals and political prisoners. The authorities assumed that isolation would break Castro's spirit. Instead, he transformed his cell block into a school. He asked sympathetic guards to smuggle in books, legal tomes, histories, revolutionary tracts. By lantern light, he lectured fellow prisoners on constitutional law and the history of other revolutions. He debated them on Marxism, democracy, and ethics. Prisoners called him El Professor. In return, he treated them with kindness, sharing meager rations, helping a cellmate with fever, teaching a blind man to recite lines from José Martí. Seeing his influence, prison officials moved him to solitary confinement. For months, Castro lived in a closet-sized cell, surviving on stale bread and thin soup. But even in darkness, the voice of his conviction echoed. He wrote notes on toilet paper, blueprints for agrarian reform, coded plans for escape, meditations on justice. When guards found the scraps, they simply laughed. "Words won't free you, lawyer." Pressure from the United States Embassy, worried that Batista's harsh tactics were destabilizing the region, led to an unexpected amnesty. On May 15, 1955, the prison gates clanged open. Castro strode out, thin, hollow-eyed, wearing the same white outfit he had used at trial. He carried nothing but a small leather satchel. He traveled to Havana, then boarded a ship to Mexico City. In the teeming streets of Coyoacán, he rented a room above a papaya vendor's stall. To survive, he gave Spanish lessons to American students, worked as a handyman, and occasionally sold produce at the local market. Despite exhaustion, his mind remained sharp. He sought out fellow exiles and revolutionaries. Raúl Castro, his loyal younger brother; Juan Almeida, a fellow Moncada survivor; Eloy Gutierrez Manoyo, a dashing anti-Batista activist; and most importantly, Ernesto Che Guevara, a young Argentine doctor whose calm intellect balanced Castro's fiery rhetoric. In cramped apartments, around wobbly wooden tables, they pored over maps of Cuba. They marked sugar plantations, army barracks, and likely landing sites along the eastern shore. Che sketched logistics: food caches, ammunition sources, mule caravans. Fidel drafted proclamations, calls to arms, appeals to students, manifestos on agrarian justice. Day and night, they planned the overthrow of Batista's regime, convinced that only armed struggle could free Cuba. By late autumn 1956, the group had recruited 84 volunteers. Doctors, students, peasants, and a handful of Spanish Civil War veterans. With funds raised from sympathetic Cuban exiles in Miami and Mexico City, they chartered the yacht Granma, an aging vessel barely seaworthy but large enough to hold men and material. On November 25th, under gray skies, the Granma slipped out of Tuxpan, Veracruz. As Havana faded on the horizon, Fidel stood at the bow, clutching the green and white flag he had designed. A white star in a red triangle, stripes echoing Cuba's own flag. Somewhere between hope and dread, he whispered, "For Cuba." The voyage was calamitous. Storms tossed the yacht on mountainous waves. Seasickness crippled half the crew. Fuel lines ruptured, and the engine conked out. Yet comradeship endured. By candle-lit nights, they sang revolutionary songs. Marseillaise transformed into Spanish, poetry ending in shouts of "Hasta la victoriousEmpre." When they finally sighted the palm-fringed shore of Orient Province on December 2nd, only 27 men were fit to stand. They waded through brackish surf, arms full of rifles and ammo. Their uniforms, olive-drab shirts and civilian trousers, were soaked and torn. No cheers greeted them, only the sharp crack of Batista's militia rifles in the distance. Smoke from burning fields rose above the jungle canopy as the government retreated, surprised by this sudden invasion. The Sierra Maestra rose before them like an emerald fortress, its peaks hidden in clouds. To reach safety, they would have to cross 50 miles of jungle, swamps, and militia-controlled territory. And so, on December 3rd, Castro issued his first orders: move by night, rest by day, speak only when needed. River water is water, boil it. Hunger is our companion. They split into small columns of 6 to 8 men, each led by a trusted lieutenant. Che's column focused on reconnaissance, mapping trails, identifying patrol routes, and forging relationships with local campesinos. Fidel's group concentrated on morale, teaching the illiterate to recognize their own names, sharing the text of history will absolve me printed on tattered sheets. In villages like El Uvero and La Plata, they found peasant families who lived in palm-thatched houses and grew coffee and plantains on tiny plots. At first, villagers eyed the armed newcomers with suspicion. But when a guerrilla doctor cured a child's fever with arnica and boiled water, fear turned to gratitude. Campesinos offered yuca and roast pork. Their grandmothers recited lines from José Martí's poems, inspiring the rebels even as they whispered, "May Batista's bullets never find us." As recruits trickled in, hunters with machetes, former soldiers disillusioned with Batista, sugarcane cutters out of work, the rebel force grew. By January 1957, they numbered over 100, small by military standards but formidable in the mountains. Guerrilla tactics emerged: ambushes on isolated patrols, sabotage of communication lines, night raids on small garrisons. Each success yielded rifles, ammunition, and food. Castro knew that victory would require more than battlefield prowess. He needed popular support. He instructed his officers to treat villagers with respect. No looting, no abuse of women, no forced conscription. He ordered the creation of mobilization brigades, groups of rebels who taught reading and writing in open clearings, using stones for chalkboards. Women joined as nurses, porters, and propagandists, carrying leaflets into remote hamlets. At dawn near the Comandante Garcia farm, Fidel held his first People's Assembly. Campesinos sat on logs and hollowed stumps. Children perched on shoulders. Castro spoke without notes, his baritone voice resonating through bamboo groves. You have tilled the land for others. Now you will own it. You have toiled in the dark. Now you will know the light of justice. This revolution is yours. He ended by handing out small printed cards showing his face in stark silhouette, the words 26 de Julio beneath. For many, it was the first piece of paper they had ever read. Mothers tucked cards into hats. Fathers pinned them to coats. A revolution sprouted in their hands. Meanwhile, back in Havana, Batista's censors banned any mention of the guerrillas. But revolution knows no borders. In a hidden cabin atop the Sierra, Che and Regis Debray, French journalist and sympathetic Marxist, worked a radio transmitter. On February 24, 1958, they sent the first broadcast of Radio Rebelled. Cuban brothers and sisters, the voice you hear is the voice of freedom. We speak from these mountains to tell you. The revolution lives, and its call will reach every corner of our land. The broadcast looped pre-recorded songs, worker anthems, peasant hymns, and stirring orchestral pieces, interspersed with reports of rebel victories. Listeners tuned homemade crystal radios at night, when Batista's patrols did not interfere. In Havana's back alleys, shopkeepers hid radios under crates. Dockworkers smuggled in batteries from the United States. Each broadcast boosted morale on both sides of the conflict. Enraged by these incursions, Batista sent dozens of battalions into Orient and Camagüey provinces. He employed helicopters to drop tear gas, artillery to shell suspected camps, and even napalm to scorch the undergrowth. Villages were leveled. Suspected sympathizers disappeared. Reports of torture and summary executions filtered back to the world press. The United Nations received petitions. Students in Mexico City staged protests. Clergy in Latin America condemned Batista's war on his own people. But heavy-handed tactics only deepened popular anger. Each burned hut yielded more recruits for the rebels, and Batista's troops, ignorant of jungle warfare, suffered staggering casualties. By spring 1958, rebel columns had established rear bases deep in the mountains, medical posts for the wounded, and food distribution networks. Guerrillas learned to move swiftly, striking villages sympathetic to government forces, cutting communications, then vanishing into the mist. On May 28, 1958, at the Battle of La Plata, Castro's forces ambushed a column of Batista's army moving to secure the coastal highway. Using stolen uniforms and false radio signals, they lured soldiers into a narrow gorge. At the rebels' signal, machetes roared, rifles opened fire, and men fell in the thick underbrush. When the dust settled, over 100 troops lay dead. The rebels captured machine guns, mortars, and crates of ammunition. Word of the victory spread across Cuba in a single day, as Radio Rebelled broadcast then replayed the battle report. Emboldened, Castro ordered a simultaneous attack on Palma Soriano's garrison. 200 guerrillas, many newly conscripted campesinos, flanked the town after midnight, cutting power lines and seizing the radio station. By dawn, they held Palma Soriano, freeing political prisoners and distributing leaflets urging locals to join the revolution. Batista's regime teetered. Corruption sapped troop morale. U.S. military advisors criticized the use of heavy bombardment on civilians. Cuban exiles in Miami, once staunch Batista supporters, reversed course, funneling money and weapons to Castro's front. Diplomatic isolation grew. The Organization of American States condemned Batista's human rights abuses. Tourism collapsed as travelers avoided Cuba's headline-grabbing violence. Chapter 3: Seizing Havana and Cementing Control. The first light of January 1st, 1959, broke over Havana in muted gold, bathing the city's faded pastels in a hopeful glow. Beneath that glow, life stirred in the early morning cafes along Calle Obispo, as vendors arranged fruit baskets and fishermen hauled in nets along the Malecon. Yet an undercurrent of anticipation thrummed through Havana's cobblestone streets. Rumors, carried on the wind, spoke of columns of ragged men bearing green olive fatigues and the banner of 26 de Julio advancing toward the capital. In neighborhoods from Centro Havana to Vedado, children dashed to windows and elders stepped onto stoops, gazing eastward as if expecting the sun itself to arrive on horseback. At precisely 10 a.m., the roar of engines shattered the stillness. A line of battered jeeps, once the property of Batista's military police, rumbled through the eastern gate, their tires kicking up dust. Atop the lead vehicle stood Fidel Castro, his lean frame draped in fatigues, his cap tilted at a rakish angle. He raised a gauntlet fist to the sky. Behind him, pioneers of the revolution sat shoulder to shoulder. Camilo Cienfuegos, sporting his trademark black cap and a grin that seemed almost boyish. Che Guevara, face impassive yet eyes blazing. Raul Castro, disciplined and watchful, and countless others whose faces reflected exhaustion mixed with triumph. As the convoy snaked down Avenida Cespedes into the heart of Havana, crowds gathered on balconied apartments and market stalls. Shopkeepers closed shutters to join the throngs. Housewives paused in doorways, aprons still dusted with flour. Barbers left scissors poised mid-air. When the jeeps reached the Plaza de la Revolution, the scene verged on delirium. Tens of thousands surged forward, sea green shirts and machete-scarred faces pressed close, shouting, "Viva la Revolution!" Their voices echoed off the José Martí Memorial Tower, vibrating through the memorial's polished white stone. Fidel dismounted and strode to a simple wooden podium, his gait measured, as if testing the weight of each moment. He looked over the sea of faces, dock workers with calloused hands, university students holding crisp notebooks, campesinos in straw hats, children perched on shoulders. Then he spoke in a voice that wafted like incense over the crowd. Today, the revolution lives in every Cuban heart. Today, we liberate not only land, but dignity. Today, we whisper no longer of what could be, but of what will be. He paused for applause, its thunder nearly drowning out his next words. Land must belong to those who till it. Education must reach every child. Health must be a right, not a privilege. No Cuban shall go hungry again. At that, the assembled crowds roared approval. In the distance, palace guards watched from the presidential palace balcony, their stiff uniforms a bitter contrast to the exuberant masses below. Within hours, Havana's landscape transformed. General Eulogio Cantillo, nominal head of the army, offered Batista safe passage out of the country. In the early afternoon haze, the last Loyalist tanks rolled away from the city's arteries, their tracks carving deep ruts in asphalt that would soon be repurposed for tractors and bicycles. Street barricades fell to jostling civilians who reclaimed wooden planks for firewood. Havana's police force, once feared for its loyalty to the dictator, dissolved. Many officers discarded badges and fled. Others donned civilian clothes and blended into the jubilant masses. But celebration did not mean chaos. From the moment Havana fell, Fidel set about consolidating control. He established a provisional government and named José Miró Cardona as prime minister, a respected jurist whose moderate reputation reassured nervous diplomats. In the old presidential offices, rechristened the Palace of the Revolution, Castro met with foreign attachés. The Soviet ambassador, bristling at first, relaxed when offered strong coffee. The Canadian consul, unfamiliar with guerrilla etiquette, nearly stumbled on stepping stones in the Rose Garden. And the American consul, clad in a crisp suit and aviator sunglasses, arrived expecting disaster but instead encountered calm authority. That same evening, in a swift act broadcast live over makeshift loudspeakers, Fidel decreed agrarian reform law 1. Under its terms, estates larger than 1,000 acres were expropriated without compensation. Looming haciendas, symbols of feudal oppression, were fenced off by campesinos who had once bent under the weight of sugarcane. In towns like Mayari and Camagüey, oversized signs went up overnight. Tierra para el que la trabaja. Land for those who work it. Villagers, many illiterate until days ago, read the decree aloud, passed it door to door, and celebrated with impromptu dances under lantern-lit trees. Yet parallel to that reform was another, darker initiative, the revolutionary tribunals. Within the vault-like walls of La Cabana Fortress, perched like a sentinel over the harbor, a mix of young lawyers, many fresh from Moncada's aftermath, and combat-hardened fighters convened kangaroo courts. Defendants included Batista's secret police officers, military commanders notorious for torture, and politicians accused of embezzlement. Proceedings were swift. Charges read, witnesses called, verdict rendered, sentences piled up. Hundreds of men and women condemned to death by firing squad. In the courtyard below, onlookers whispered of poetic justice. A former guard, known for cracking skulls with a baton, fell to a volley of bullets as a military band played quietly in the background. Some cried out for mercy, but most approved the fierce retribution. Foreign correspondents filmed hooded prisoners walking blindfolded to their fate, then cutting to smiling peasants throwing flowers at guerrilla fighters. International human rights groups protested methods, but Cubans weary of fear applauded the end of impunity. This mixed legacy of reform and retribution marked the revolution's second day. On day 3, Havana's cultural institutions awoke to new masters. Professors once silenced by Batista's decrees returned to lecture halls at the University of Havana. The National Ballet, disbanded for immoral decadence, received government funding and reopened under Alicia Alonso's artistic direction. Libraries stuffed with censored books through open doors. Murals of Marx and Murti replaced fading murals of Spanish conquistadors. Poets, who had once been forced underground, now read sonnets praising agrarian justice in the Grand Hall of the Gran Teatro de la Habana. At the same time, political pluralism was closing. Opposition newspapers were shuttered. Their presses melted into plowshares. Radio stations rebranded as Radio Rebelled Havana, broadcasting daily bulletins from Fidel and cheery jingles about health clinics and reading campaigns. Communist and socialist parties, long suppressed by Batista, merged under a provisional umbrella, the integrated revolutionary organizations, laying the groundwork for a one-party state. Day by day, minutes after his televised speeches, Fidel toured the city. He walked Havana's narrow alleys, shaking hands with factory workers at the Bacardi distillery, donning protective gear in the Bajucal military factory, and greeting choir boys at the Nuestra Señora de la Caridad church. He listened to starving families in Barrio Chino recount nights spent in bread lines. To each, he promised reparations, rations of rice and beans, health care visits from field doctors, and places in evening literacy classes. In the city's outskirts, mobile clinics rolled into dusty barrios. Medics, many recently demobilized soldiers, arrived in trucks stocked with penicillin and diphtheria vaccines. City officials appointed by Castro established health committees, drawing maps to locate every home lacking latrines. Within a week, tens of thousands of children received vaccinations. Outbreaks of typhoid and smallpox that had once been annual scourges were stamped out. Across from those medical triumphs, the government pressed ahead with education. Havana's first school for peasant children opened in a repurposed barracks near Regla. Wooden desks, painted bright green, filled makeshift classrooms where 20 children sat under palm leaf roofs. Young revolutionary volunteers, students themselves, drew chalk lessons on blackboards. A is for Abuela, B is for Bolivar, C is for Castro. Parents, illiterate only days before, watched as their toddlers traced letters, tears of pride sliding down weathered cheeks. Meanwhile, the sweeping agrarian reforms sparked tensions abroad. United States-owned sugar companies, stripped of concessions, sued in international courts. U.S. diplomats filed protests. American-owned oil refineries faced expropriation. In Washington, President Eisenhower's administration severed diplomatic ties in March, citing communist infiltration. But U.S. tourists, hungry for adventure, still booked flights to witness the new Cuba. Some carried Ralph Lauren polo shirts. Others, clandestine satchels of cash destined for anti-Castro exiles in Miami. Back in Havana, the new government navigated these pressures with a mix of defiance and pragmatism. Che Guevara, as president of the National Bank, negotiated crude for food deals with Canada. Raul Castro, commanding the Revolutionary Armed Forces, invited Soviet military advisors to train officers in guerrilla tactics, an act that would draw both suspicion and aid from Moscow. And Fidel, in meetings with foreign ambassadors, spoke of non-alignment while accepting medical scholarships for students in the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. Calcomite, a community council, then broke into working groups, grain distribution, road maintenance. Across from those medical triumphs, the government pressed ahead with education. Havana's first school for peasant children opened in a repurposed barracks near Regla. Wooden desks, painted bright green, filled makeshift classrooms where 20 children sat under palm leaf roofs. Young revolutionary volunteers, students themselves, drew chalk lessons on blackboards. A is for Abuela, B is for Bolivar, C is for Castro. Parents, illiterate only days before, watched as their toddlers traced letters, tears of pride sliding down weathered cheeks. Meanwhile, the sweeping agrarian reforms sparked tensions abroad. United States-owned sugar companies, stripped of concessions, sued in international courts. U.S. diplomats filed protests. American-owned oil refineries faced expropriation. In Washington, President Eisenhower's administration severed diplomatic ties in March, citing communist infiltration. But U.S. tourists, hungry for adventure, still booked flights to witness the new Cuba. Some carried Ralph Lauren polo shirts. Others, clandestine satchels of cash destined for anti-Castro exiles in Miami. Back in Havana, the new government navigated these pressures with a mix of defiance and pragmatism. Che Guevara, as president of the National Bank, negotiated crude for food deals with Canada. Raul Castro, commanding the Revolutionary Armed Forces, invited Soviet military advisors to train officers in guerrilla tactics, an act that would draw both suspicion and aid from Moscow. And Fidel, in meetings with foreign ambassadors, spoke of non-alignment while accepting medical scholarships for students in the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. By mid-March, 6 weeks after the fall of Batista, statistics bolstered the narrative. Illiteracy rates in Havana had dropped by nearly half. Rice and bean rations had stabilized prices. Land redistribution had transferred thousands of acres to tenant farmers. International observers, aware of ideological leanings, nevertheless noted the pace. Cuba's reforms had outstripped those of many newly independent nations in Asia and Africa. But behind the numbers lay questions. How much would the revolution rely on terror? Could Cuba remain sovereign in the face of Cold War pressures? Would the gains in social welfare endure under a de facto one-party rule? On April 1st, Castro convened a gathering in the Plaza de Armas. Under ancient royal palms, he addressed counting crowds. "We are a people awakened. In our veins flows the blood of Murti, of Cespedes, of all who fought for our birth. Let no force disable our will." Afterward, he wandered the plaza, greeting artisans in the book market, listening to guitarists strumming campesino songs. In the evening breeze, Havana seemed to hold its breath, imagining what the future might bring. As Chapter 3 draws to a close, Havana lay before Fidel like an open book, each district a chapter to write. Behind him rose the stone battlements of La Cabana. Ahead spread the Caribbean Sea, wide and beckoning. Between those 2 points, revolution had seized a city, tamed its chaos, and begun the long work of remaking society. In the months to come, literacy would spread, schools would rise, and hospitals would cure. But for now, it was enough that a dictator had fallen, and that the cheers of Havana's people still echoed in the January air. Proof that even the most hardened regime could be undone by a determined few armed with conviction, courage, and the promise of justice. Chapter 4: The Literacy Crusade, A Nation Teaches Itself. When Fidel Castro first stood before an assembly of campesinos in the eastern hills of Cuba, he spoke not of guns or guerrilla victories, but of letters and learning. The words danced on a makeshift chalkboard beneath a thatched roof. Leer es vencer. To read is to conquer. It was January 1961, and weeks after seizing Havana's power, Castro turned his attention to a new front, the war on ignorance. In a land where nearly a quarter of adults could not read or write, he vowed to eradicate illiteracy within a year. To many, the goal seemed impossible. Dense mountains, scattered villages, and the echoes of centuries of neglect. Yet, in those cold dawns and sultry afternoons that followed, an army of volunteers set out to prove that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword. The National Literacy Campaign was announced on December 22, 1960, in a radio address that crackled through crystal sets in homes across the island. Castro's voice, warm yet resolute, outlined the plan. Recruit hundreds of thousands of youth and workers to serve as brigadistas. Pair each with an illiterate learner and deploy them to every corner of the Republic, from the wind-swept keys of the Southern Cays to the coffee terraces of the Sierra Maestra. Simple caravans were dispatched, painted white and bearing slogans like "Venceremos," "We will overcome." Inside, volunteers packed flatbreads, notebooks, chalk, and blackboards no larger than a suitcase. By early January, university campuses emptied as students donned shorts and carried rucksacks instead of textbooks. In Evora, a group of young women piled onto a rickety bus bound for Las Tunas province. They carried homemade lesson plans, letters of the alphabet sketched in bright chalk, basic arithmetic exercises, and primers on health and farming. Their uniforms, plain denim shirts and skirts, marked them as partisans of a different sort, warriors of knowledge. At dawn's first light, the brigadistas dispersed into the countryside. They trudged along dusty roads, through thickets of guava and guanabana trees, splashing across streams and clambering up steep inclines to reach isolated hamlets. In each village, they made their presence known with flowers and friendly greetings. Elderly women, eyes clouded by years of toil, emerged from palm huts. Men in straw hats paused from cutting cane. Children stared in wonder at newcomers who spoke the local dialect but carried gifts of chalk and paper. One of those brigadistas, Maria Elena, was 19 and had never been east of Havana. Yet she found herself in Beatty Macurage's, home to sugarcane workers whose families had lived under semi-feudal conditions since the Spanish colonial era. She set up her tiny blackboard on 2 wooden crates, gathering 7 villagers around. The eldest, Dona Teresa, was 65 and had never seen a newspaper headline. Her hands shook as Maria Elena traced in bright white chalk. "Repeat after me," she said. "Ah." The others echoed, breathless with excitement. Within days, the group spelled soul and lose, words as bright as their dreams. In each brigade, leadership fostered accountability and camaraderie. Each afternoon, volunteers convened for reflection sessions, sharing challenges, improvising lesson tactics, and singing revolutionary songs to uplift tired spirits. They penned graffiti on roadside stones, "Yo soy 26" and "Tierra y Libertad," reminders that this campaign was an extension of the struggle against Batista's tyranny. Spirit courses through action. Action fuels change. Meanwhile, central coordination in Havana labored to keep the wheels turning. Ministry of Education officials pored over maps, allocating brigades where need was greatest. Trucks loaded with supplies rolled out daily from warehouses repurposed from Batista's army. Civil engineers repaired decaying rural roads overnight, often with campesino labor. Mobile kitchens followed the caravans, serving rice and beans cooked over open fires. Doctors and nurses, many from revolutionary brigades themselves, set up health clinics alongside literacy classes, treating infections and encouraging hygiene practices. In an instant, the campaign became a holistic effort, combating ignorance, disease, and the sense of abandonment that had for generations defined rural life. Back in Havana, the campaign's pulse beat through the studios of Radio Rebelled. Daily bulletins reported statistics. Villages reached, learners registered, books distributed. Amid the numbers, human stories emerged. A tobacco farmer who learned to write love letters to his wife. A child who discovered the joy of reading Murtie's verses. A grandmother who memorized her new identity card number, unlocking access to government services. Each story was read over the airwaves as proof. Revolution was not only about sugar quotas or Soviet alliances. It was about the simple dignity of being able to read one's own name. In March, the government declared a month of Great Crusade intensity. Youth organizations rallied support, staging rallies in city squares before embarking on second missions to reinforce earlier gains. Meanwhile, opposition media in Miami dismissed the campaign as propaganda, questioning whether a handful of volunteers could truly educate millions. Yet photos smuggled out showed villages vibrantly alive. Chalkboards on palm leaf roofs, adults reading weather reports in newspapers, liberated literacy offices hung with posters of Fidel and Murtie side by side. By mid-year, reports claimed that illiteracy had plummeted to single digits, a figure unthinkable 12 months earlier. Observers from UNESCO and the Organization of American States came to verify. They walked dusty lanes, carrying clipboards, administering reading tests. At a makeshift schoolhouse in Las Mercedes, an Italian delegate watched in awe as a group of sugarcane cutters read passages from an arithmetic primer without hesitation. The delegate scribbled furiously, later approving Cuba's results as among the fastest and most comprehensive literacy advances ever recorded. Yet, beyond the accolades, the campaign wrought deeper change. In village plazas, literacy classes continued after December's deadline, evolving into communal forums for political education. Learners debated land rights, healthcare policies, and Cuba's place in a bipolar world. Their newfound ability to read allowed them to access government bulletins directly, reducing reliance on intermediaries prone to corruption. Health pamphlets on cholera prevention were read and passed among neighbors, curbing outbreaks. Farmers consulted agricultural manuals to improve maize yields. The revolution, once narrowly defined by armed struggle, broadened into a social transformation led by informed citizens. As the sun set on December 22, 1961, the anniversary of the campaign's launch, Havana's Plaza de la Revolution swelled with hundreds of thousands of newly literate citizens. They stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching certificates printed that morning. Names spelled in ink that shone like new hope. Castro, stepping onto a glittering stage, looked out over the sea of faces. Workers in overalls, doctors in white coats, mothers in headscarves, children on their fathers' shoulders. The wind carried their cheers across the bay, mingling with the tolling bells of La Habana Cathedral. In that moment, the revolution had transformed itself into a vast library of living books. Every citizen a page, every community a chapter. The campaign did not end with certificates. In the months and years that followed, the government invested in permanent rural schools, forklifting textbooks to remote provinces. Teacher training institutes churned out thousands of educators committed to lifelong instruction. Mobile libraries roamed dusty roads, shelves bulging with donated volumes from allied nations. Cultural centers opened, hosting poetry readings, film screenings, and workshops on technical skills. Cuba's literacy rate, once lower than many African colonies, rose to rival that of Western Europe. For an island long defined by sugar and surveillance, the revolution had delivered the most potent export of all: knowledge. perhaps the most remarkable legacy was not in statistics but in spirit. In the quiet corners of the countryside, elders who had once labored without recognition now read newspapers aloud in community gatherings. Youths schooled in guerrilla tactics now took up pens instead of pistols, writing essays and poems. Health workers no longer treated patients as passive recipients but as active participants empowered by understanding. Across the island, the revolution's promise became both tangible and self-renewing. Each literate citizen could educate another, carving a chain of enlightenment that even the harshest embargo could not sever. As Chapter 4 closes, dawn breaks once more over the Sierra Maestra peaks. In a small clearing where the first makeshift classroom stood, a new generation convenes. They carry modern textbooks, laptops humming on solar panels, and determination fierce as the day we first set chalk to board. They speak of digital literacy, environmental stewardship, and cultural preservation. In their voices echo the words of that inaugural lesson, Leer es vencer, to read is to conquer, and in Cuba's grand experiment, conquest meant liberation not by force of arms but by the force of ideas. Chapter 5, Building Schools, Molding Minds. The trucks came at dawn. Their engines rumbled like thunder across the hills, kicking up swirls of red dust as they rolled into the valley. They carried timber, concrete, bundles of rebar tied like sheaves of sugarcane. Following behind came engineers in grease-streaked overalls, students in blue kerchiefs, and teachers with notebooks clutched to their chests. At the edge of the village of El Jicaro, where there had once been only scrubland and a crumbling chapel, a white sign was planted into the soil.
It read simply, Escuela en Construcción.
The villagers gathered to watch, cautious but curious. They had heard rumors in town. Some said the government was building a military post. Others thought it might be a health clinic. But when the blueprints were unrolled on the hood of a truck and the word Escuela appeared in bold black ink, an old man removed his hat and said, simply, "Now we will be a real town." Fidel Castro's push to construct a web of rural schools across Cuba was not just a response to illiteracy. It was an act of transformation. In his mind, a revolution without education was only half a revolution. Literacy was the foundation, but structure had to follow. So, beginning in 1961, just as the National Literacy Campaign reached its crescendo, construction brigades were dispatched across the island with one mission: to raise new schools from the ground up, hundreds of them, built with revolutionary speed. The need was urgent. For centuries, Cuba's countryside had been an education desert. Schools, where they existed, were reserved for the children of landowners or urban elites. In remote villages, children worked the fields by age 6, illiteracy passed down like an heirloom. Now, the revolution sought to flip that inheritance on its head. The Ministry of Education worked alongside the army, farmers, and youth groups to identify strategic locations. Villages like El Jicaro, which sat at the intersection of 3 farming cooperatives, were chosen as hubs. From there, materials and personnel radiated outward. Each school followed a simple but flexible design. Long, rectangular buildings with thick cement walls to weather the tropical storms. Open windows to catch the breeze. Chalkboards on each end, flanked by portraits of Martí and Castro. The floors were poured by volunteers. The desks were carved by local carpenters. Teachers, many of them fresh graduates of new teacher training institutes, arrived with bedrolls and lesson plans. In many cases, they slept in their classrooms, hanging mosquito nets above the chalkboard. Elena, a 23-year-old from Cienfuegos, was one such teacher. She arrived at her post in El Jicaro with 2 suitcases and a burning sense of purpose. Her father had died in Batista's prisons. Her mother had taught her to read with the poems of José Martí. Now, Elena was to be the first formal educator in a village of nearly 300 people. She remembered the first morning clearly. The children shy, their parents watchful. One boy, named Luisito, had never worn shoes before. His toes curled at the feel of the wooden floor. But by the end of the week, he could write his name. The curriculum Elena taught was unlike any taught in the pre-revolutionary past. Reading and arithmetic, of course, were central, but equally important were lessons in hygiene, nutrition, and farming techniques. Students were taught how to identify mosquito breeding grounds, how to prepare a balanced meal, how to rotate crops to prevent soil exhaustion. And woven through every subject was ideology. Not dry dogma, but revolutionary context. History lessons included not only Martí and Maceo but Marx and Lenin. Geography was taught with maps that emphasized the struggle of the global South. Even math problems were written around sugar quotas and harvest projections. Some called it indoctrination, but to the revolutionaries it was preparation. To build a new Cuba, they argued, students had to see themselves not just as individuals but as part of a collective destiny. The future engineer in Camagüey had to understand the plight of the farmer in Holguin. The teenage midwife needed to know not just how to deliver babies, but why maternal health was a revolutionary priority. Education in this context was both a right and a duty, and it was working. In El Jicaro, the school quickly became the heart of the village. It hosted not just classes but community meetings, vaccination drives, and film screenings. On Friday evenings, Elena read aloud from newspapers to parents who were still learning. During hurricane season, the school became a shelter. Children began to dream beyond the cane fields. Luisito said he wanted to be a doctor. Another girl, Milagros, wrote an essay about becoming a scientist. Her mother wept when she read it. As demand grew, so did the infrastructure around education. Teacher training institutes, or escuelas formadoras, were erected in every province. These were not elite academies, but practical campuses designed to produce instructors by the thousands. They emphasized fieldwork, political consciousness, and adaptability. Students studied by day and practiced by night, often in real classrooms under supervision. Many were graduates of the very rural schools now multiplying across the countryside. One such graduate, Jorge, had learned to read in a makeshift literacy class in 1961. Now, in 1964, he was teaching others to do the same. In his final year of training, he was posted to a hilltop village that had seen no government presence before. There, he encountered a 70-year-old man who had never held a pencil. Jorge sat with him every evening, helping him trace the loops of letters. By year's end, the old man read the Gaceta official out loud to his grandchildren. This cycle of education feeding education created a kind of momentum. The revolution had promised dignity, and schools delivered it one sentence at a time. It wasn't just about reading, it was about reshaping the very idea of what it meant to be Cuban. No longer merely a laborer or a housewife, the citizen became a thinker, a speaker, a participant. And that shift changed villages. Roads were paved to reach schools. Electricity was installed to power classrooms. Health posts followed, then community centers. The school became the seed, and from it grew the future. Still, the program was not without tension. There were parents who distrusted the ideological bent. Some feared that their children, exposed to Marxist teachings, would reject religion or tradition. Others simply missed the labor their children once provided. In tobacco country, one cooperative leader threatened to pull his workers if their children stayed in school past noon. The ministry responded not with punishment, but with negotiation. New calendars were drawn to accommodate harvests. Work-study programs were launched, allowing students to contribute without abandoning learning. By 1965, the results were undeniable. Enrollment in rural primary schools had doubled. Dropout rates fell sharply. More than 10,000 new teachers had been certified. Perhaps more importantly, Cuba's education system had become a model, praised by UNESCO and observed by nations from Algeria to Vietnam. Delegations toured schools in Pinar del Rio and Santiago, marveling at classrooms where barefoot children debated collective farming policy with the confidence of trained speakers. The physical transformation was visible from the sky. Where once there had been clusters of cane and thickets of brush, now stood rows of whitewashed school buildings. At dawn, the national anthem played from tinny speakers. Students stood at attention, hands over hearts. Lessons began promptly at 8. By noon, the air buzzed with recitations. In the afternoon, children cleaned their classrooms as a form of civic duty. It was regimented, yes, but it was theirs. In one particularly remote village, San Jose del Lago, the school transformed not just education but economics. After a year of classes on soil science and market logistics, students proposed a co-op to grow plantains using improved irrigation. The co-op tripled its yield within a season. The surplus funded textbooks and solar panels. One classroom soon had a working projector. The village had never seen a movie before. Elena, still teaching in El Jicaro, received a visit from a former student in 1966. Luisito, now 15, had been accepted into a pre-med program. He handed her a letter. In it, he wrote, "When you taught me to read my name, you gave me a future. I want to give that future to others." She cried, then folded the letter and placed it beneath the glass top of her desk, beside a photo of her parents. The story repeated itself across the island. Names changed, villages changed, but the arc was the same. Where a school appeared, so did hope, so did connection. Children began writing letters to other classrooms across provinces. Pen pals debated favorite poets and shared advice on keeping goats healthy. In a nation once defined by separation between rich and poor, urban and rural, white and black, the school became the bridge. By the close of the decade, Cuba had become one of the most literate nations in the developing world. But the victory was deeper than statistics. In every village where a school had been built, a generation had been shaped, not just by books but by belief. Belief that they mattered, that their voice, no matter how small, was part of something larger. That education was not the privilege of the few, but the foundation of all. And in that belief, molded daily through chalk and sweat and dreams scribbled in notebooks, Fidel Castro's revolution achieved something rare. It etched itself not just in stone or slogans, but in the minds of those it touched. Minds that would question, think, build, and perhaps someday even teach. Chapter 6: education in the shadow of repression. In the dusty courtyard of a rural school in Sancti Spiritus, the flag flapped in the wind as a group of children recited their morning pledge. The sun hadn't yet burned off the mist from the hills, and the teacher's voice echoed through the open-air hallways, calm but firm. Seremos como el Che. The children repeated it in unison. We will be like Che. It was more than a mantra. It was a warning, a promise, a hope, woven into the fabric of Cuban childhood. In Fidel Castro's Cuba, education was both shield and sword, an instrument of empowerment and a mechanism of control. As the schools rose from the soil and the people learned to read, the state learned to watch. The same revolution that taught a nation to write also taught it to stay silent. The National Literacy Campaign had awakened something powerful. For the first time, the Cuban state had eyes and ears in every home. Teenage brigadistas, some no older than 15, lived with rural families and kept careful records of who was cooperative and who was skeptical. Those notes, collected and submitted to the Ministry of Education, were not always limited to pedagogy. If a father refused to attend literacy meetings or mocked the revolution slogans, the brigadista might report it. If a mother discouraged her daughter from joining the Federation of Cuban Women, that too could be noted. It was called vigilance. It was also surveillance. As schools expanded and the education system became a national project, the relationship between classroom and state deepened. Teachers were expected not only to instruct but to monitor. Political loyalty became a job requirement. The ministry reviewed teacher evaluations not just for academic effectiveness, but for ideological consistency. A teacher who failed to include lessons on revolutionary heroes, who omitted Marxist theory or failed to report anti-government attitudes among students or parents, could be reassigned, or worse, blacklisted. Even students learned to watch one another. Children were praised for revolutionary vigilance. In some classrooms, they were encouraged to write letters about their home life, about what their parents said after the evening news, about who listened to Miami radio stations. The classroom bulletin board would feature portraits of model students, chosen not only for academic success but for their political commitment. Peer pressure and praise became subtle instruments of control. At first, it was almost invisible. Then it became routine. It was a paradox that defined the Cuban experiment. While children learned to read novels, memorize historical speeches, and even explore scientific theory, they also learned there were boundaries they could not cross. The revolution promised intellectual development, but only within carefully drawn lines. Questioning Batista's rule was required. Questioning Castro's? Dangerous. In the university towns of Havana and Santiago, where the nation's brightest minds gathered, the boundaries were clearer still. Philosophy classes debated Kant and Hegel, but always landed squarely in Marxist dialectics. Literature courses read Tolstoy and Neruda, but works deemed ideologically suspect, such as George Orwell or Milan Kundera, were absent. Students who pushed back risked being labeled conflictive. Some lost scholarships. Others disappeared from the classroom altogether. Still, for many, the trade-off seemed worthwhile. Parents who had grown up illiterate now sent children to college. Rural families who once saw education as a distant luxury now had schools within walking distance. There were free lunches, school uniforms, and even state-sponsored summer camps. Children received vaccines and health checkups as part of their enrollment. The state provided not only textbooks but eyeglasses and shoes. For a peasant who had known nothing but toil and silence, The school was a window to a world their parents had never dreamed of. One mother, named Juliana, once described the experience with quiet pride. Her daughter Maritza had grown up in a thatched hut without running water. At age 7, she brought home a book of poems. By age 11, she was writing her own. "I never cared who taught her the poems," Juliana said, "as long as she could read them." But that pride existed alongside fear. In Juliana's village, a neighbor had been detained after criticizing a local official during a school meeting. His son was removed from the student council the following week. No explanation was given. The message, however, was clear: be careful what you say. Be careful who hears. Even in the upper echelons of academia, loyalty was scrutinized. Professors had to sign declarations of revolutionary commitment. Some were required to attend political education seminars. Failure to do so could mean losing access to research grants, travel permits, or publishing opportunities. Some complied out of belief, others out of necessity, and yet, amidst the ideological rigidity, the education system produced genuine brilliance. Cuban scientists contributed to global health research. Mathematicians won international awards. Doctors trained in Cuba went on to serve in more than 30 countries. A sense of national pride, forged through disciplined study and communal labor, shaped a generation. The irony was painful and powerful. The same system that stifled dissent also built excellence. The government kept meticulous data. By 1962, illiteracy had fallen from over 23% to under 4%. School attendance surpassed 95%. Teacher training institutes, once makeshift facilities, became prestigious centers. The average Cuban child, regardless of race or class, now completed more years of schooling than their counterparts in much of Latin America. International delegations visited Havana to observe the phenomenon. They praised the discipline, the infrastructure, the spirit. But outside the spotlight, the cost remained. Families whispered at home. Teenagers practiced double speech, saying one thing in public and another behind closed doors. Books had to be hidden, opinions filtered. There was a generation raised in literacy and fear, fluent in both grammar and silence. Over time, the contradictions deepened. In the 1970s and 80s, as economic pressures mounted, the education system remained one of the few stable institutions. Schools continued to function, even during food shortages and blackouts. But with each passing year, the control mechanisms became more entrenched. Civics classes turned into loyalty assessments. Independent student unions were prohibited. Visiting lecturers were vetted for political reliability. And the narrative was fixed. Cuba had been rescued from ignorance by the revolution, and questioning that salvation was betrayal. Still, many continued to believe. For every suppressed writer, there was a grateful nurse. For every muzzled historian, a trained engineer. The benefits of education were tangible and lasting. Infant mortality dropped. Life expectancy rose. Literacy opened doors to health awareness, civic participation, and a sense of identity tied not to wealth or lineage, but to shared knowledge. Peasant could read the Constitution. A farmhand could draft a petition. And yet the question lingered. Could education alone justify repression? Could universal schooling compensate for the absence of political pluralism? These were not questions asked aloud, but they echoed nonetheless. In the post-Soviet era, as Cuba faced a devastating economic collapse known as the Special Period, the schools stayed open. Teachers taught by candlelight. Children brought stools from home when chairs were scarce. Lessons were written on scraps of cardboard. And still, the morning pledge was recited, Seremos como el Che. International observers marveled. Cuba, though impoverished, remained one of the most educated nations in the hemisphere. Its doctors were exported like prized goods. Its literacy campaigns were replicated in Venezuela and Bolivia. The revolution, it seemed, had achieved something permanent. But younger Cubans, born after the Cold War, began to ask different questions. Why were some books banned? Why couldn't they choose their own leaders? Why did speaking out mean risking a scholarship or a job? These questions didn't always lead to revolt. Often they led to resignation, but they marked a shift. One teacher, Ana Rosa, who had taught for 30 years, once said, "We gave them the tools to think, and now they think in ways we were told not to." She didn't say it with regret. She said it with hope, because the legacy of education, even under watchful eyes, is not so easily controlled. Minds once awakened are hard to silence. Fidel Castro, in his later speeches, often returned to the theme of education. He spoke of it as his proudest achievement. In one address, he declared, "The true wealth of a nation is not in its gold or oil, but in its knowledge." For many Cubans, this felt true, but others heard a different message. We gave you knowledge so you would not ask for freedom. Today, the debate continues. In the exile communities of Miami and Madrid, former Cuban students remember both their first book and their first whispered warning. Inside Cuba, parents still send children to schools that function better than many in richer nations. But they also teach them when to speak and when to stay quiet. The schools still stand. Many of them built in the 60s and 70s are weathered, their walls cracked by time but still full of voices. Children still memorize poetry and learn science. They still pledge to be like Che. But they also hear stories from cousins abroad, watch illegal media, and wonder what else is out there. The revolution taught them to ask questions. Now it must face the answers.